Gbenga,
Gbenga or Benga?
Benga.
Benga. Okay. Thank you. All right. And so just to kind of jump into it, I apologize. I know I have two. I believe you're kind of more of an expert around kind of the impact on the agricultural industry, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So I think to jump into this, what I wanted to get an understanding is where do you see and kind of on what kind of items or kind of products are you seeing that farmers are really going to be getting hit on when it comes to these tariffs?
I think the biggest thing that we're seeing it on is on oilseed products like soybeans. That's always the big one because if you think about our export economy and our biggest exporters who we export to, China, Canada, Mexico. China being the biggest one, and China biggest one is with soybeans. And so we saw this during Trump's we saw this during Trump's first administration where he had the tariffs on China, but only on China. And I think it was about 15%. And then China retaliated by putting retaliatory tariffs on soybeans that impacted our markets here. And one of the things, even after the tariffs went away, it still impacted our soybean markets to this day. So now we're seeing the same kind of thing happening, except now the tariff are across the board on all kinds of products, all kinds of countries. And I think the biggest concern, especially when it comes to the agriculture industry, are what's happening to our inputs, the things that go into farming. So you think about there's tariffs on steel and aluminum. And so you're looking at tractors, you're looking at fencing, you're looking at grain bits, all the things that farmers use, their costs have gone up, which lowers their profit margins.
And speaking of those profit margins, I used to work before I was working here over in Iowa, where I think a lot of those soybeans are grown and go out of. And so I know just from talking to those guys several years ago that they were already operating under pretty tight margins. There had been droughts, there had been issues with the Mississippi itself. And so, how can you at all speak to how thin of margins are we already looking at for American farmers?
I don't have the numbers, but I think a lot of it is tight because the other thing you have to think about is the distribution of farm sizes. And so you have small, medium-sized firms and then the large industrial firms. And so the large industrial operations are, they're doing well and they're going to be doing well, but it's the small and medium ones that always had those tight margins. And so some of the things I think about the other opportunities for producing revenue, where I think about the USAID and what happened there, where they were able to produce for overseas. And then when that gets cut off, that limits their revenue. Now you're putting in the tariffs that makes those costs. And I think back in, going back to the first Trump administration, they had that market facilitation program where they paid about things like $28 billion to help farmers out. That's not an option this time around. And so now you have almost an even bigger impact where you have more the issue with the input cost, the issue with limited export markets. And then the one thing, even though this is not tariff related, that's impacting agriculture is immigration enforcement and the mass deportation scheme. And so you have that, exports are down, costs are up, and they're losing their workforce. So that's another way that these farmers are getting hit.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask because there's been just kind of a mess of different tariffs kind of tossed out and pulled back and tossed out and pulled back. And so, are there any specific that come to your mind that you think, or have there been any retaliatory tariffs announced that come to your mind that you think are going to specifically impact our farmers, impact our agricultural producers?
So one thing about this uncertainty and kind of basically a haphazard tariff scheme, because I mean, just yesterday he announced 25 or 50%. I can't keep track on India because what importing from Russia. One of the things that actually hasn't happened, and with the, quote unquote trade deals that the president's been doing, is there actually hasn't been a lot of retaliation on this to date, because with a lot of these countries, they feel like they have an opportunity to be able to get some sort of deal, some sort of lower tariff rate. And so I think one of the things that's kind of surprised me about this is that we haven't seen those retaliatory tariffs to a greater extent. One of the biggest ones is with China. There's still a 10% tariff across the board on all our products, which just has an impact on our farmers. But one of the things that it seems not as bad because there was that time in April and May where there was this kind of like back and forth where it got to the point where China was going to do 125% tariffs because we were going to do 145, and it was just, almost like made up numbers. And then China said, okay, we're going to pull back. And they said it's only 10%. But 10% is a huge cost especially with these farmers, these small and medium-sized producers who are already operating at thin margins. And we're seeing that in some of the numbers.
And then something I wanted to ask to see how much you could speak to is, and you kind of touched on it, is how much of kind of budgets or of the kind of bottom line for farmers is reliant on this kind of international trade? How much of American produce is going overseas rather than kind of staying within American shores? I don't know if people have a good understanding of that.
So I don't have the shares or percentages, but it's one of those things where if you think about the history of agriculture, especially over the last 40, 50 years, we had shifted from kind of like small farms that are able to produce for like locally. And it's like we want to produce more. Like, we want to feed the world. So we feed ourselves and we feed the world. And so it was a big push to just producing more and then finding avenues of not just export economy, but like foreign trade and, USAID and be able to produce like that. And so these provided opportunities for small and medium-sized producers to be able to compete because you didn't have to worry about competing locally or be able to produce locally, but you had these other avenues. And then you think about some of the stuff that in the previous administration. So I probably used to work at the Department of Agriculture under the Biden administration, and we were trying to find ways of providing alternate opportunities for creating revenue for small and medium-sized producers. So you think about local food banks, farm to school programs, things like that, regional food centers to be able to provide those. And so it's one of those things where they had these opportunities to be able to produce for others and to be able to not have to compete with the large industrial operations. And we're seeing over the last 6 months, all these opportunities going away where they're cutting the funding for the regional food, actually the end of the regional food program, cutting the farm to school programs, and then USAID, that's been demolished.
Right. And I wanted to ask, just in your kind of opinion, is there any way that these tariffs could benefit farmers? I know there's a lot of talk about kind of from the Trump team of using this quote unquote trade war as a way to kind of force people to buy more American products, to use more American, goods. So is this a possibility that people would then internationally buy more or domestically buy more? Could that be how this works out?
I mean, that's one of the arguments. You basically have three arguments for why you'd want to use tariffs. So one, unfair trade practices. So if you have like company or countries dumping in your country, and then that makes it unfair for the farmers, you tariff that so they're better able to compete. There's like national security concerns. So you think about semiconductors, electronics, things like that, and then economic competitiveness. So in the Biden administration, there were tariffs put on, green technology, solar panels, things like that, to be able to help domestic production. And so, but here what's happening is that we have so many different aims, so many different reasons for tariffs, and some of them are contradictory. So we don't know what's happening. So they mentioned, you want to support domestic manufacturing, support domestic production, but there are things happening where you're not supporting domestic production and cutting programs that help out, like the Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS and Science, where programs that help build that up. So if you put tariffs to support it, why would you take the money away from those other programs that also support it? They also said that, well, part of it is we want to raise revenue. The Republicans' mega bill cut 4.5 trillion on taxes, and they said, oh, it's going to be replaced by tariff revenue. But then you say, well, we also want to put tariffs on India because they're importing from Russia. So then if they stop, then you take the tariffs off and then you're lowering the revenue and then you're not doing it. So we hear so many different stories from the administration, it's hard to know what's going to work. And so because there's not a consistent goal or aim that's been well articulated, I don't think this is going to happen.
Okay. And then yeah, as you've kind of touched on, a lot of this is up in the air, and for a lot of these small farms, it's already been a pretty hard past decade for them essentially. And so do you think, is there a clear, and I can kind of guess the answer already, but is there a clear outline on when any of these farmers might know how all of this is going to impact them, when people might know how these tariffs are going to actually impact the food they eat and impact these farms that produce them?
The problem is we don't know when this tariff is going to be over. Every day it feels like there's a new thing. And as I mentioned, I was thinking about tomorrow's, basically when Liberation Day is going to be finally implemented, where we have tariff rates on 70 different countries. And so a lot of farmers are making plans about that, thinking about their export economies and which countries they're going to be able to work with. And then yesterday you have this thing with India. And so it's like you can make these plans, but then something changes and something turns around and you don't know what's going to happen. And so there's so much uncertainty. And basically, it's paralyzing the economy, not just farmers, but businesses and consumers. And to be able to answer that question, we have to know when the administration is actually going to say, this is what we're doing, this is why, this is how long it's going to last, and this is when it's going to end. And basically also have metrics about when they'll be able to say, oh, now we've achieved our goal, and it has to be one singular goal, and then be able to do that. And we haven't gotten that in the last 3 to 6 months.
Gotcha. Well, I think that's the extent of questions I had around this. Is there anything else or anything kind of around the agricultural industries, facing these tariffs that you feel is important to highlight or we haven't gone over?
I was able to make the point about the immigration workforce because I think that's the thing that people are forgetting about is that there's a farmer saying that I can figure out how to deal with tariffs, but if I'm losing half my workforce, I can't adjust for that. And so that's the thing that's just, you have these things that pile on it and it's kind of have this exponential effect that's harming these farmers.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me some time this morning.
And not a problem. Thank you.